Through offices in Chicago, New York, and Seattle, the Alford Group provides services in board development, fundraising, capital campaigns, strategic planning, corporate partnership strategy, and donor-based analytics. Our main goal is to provide guidance, tools, and structures that empower organizations to have the greatest impact possible. This webinar series runs now through October and covers a variety of topics in philanthropy. All of the webinars are free and are posted on our website. I'll speak more on that at the end of today's presentation. Today's webinar is entitled Diversity in Philanthropy, How to Reach New Demographics. And today's guest speaker, we're so pleased to have Dr. Jacqueline Copeland-Carson, who is known nationally and internationally for her work in global philanthropy. Trained as an anthropologist and urban designer, Jackie has spent the last 30 years advising nonprofits and corporations around the world, including the US, Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, and Brazil, on social change and social responsibilities. Dr. Copeland-Carson is currently the Chief Program and Operations Officer at Catholic Charities of Santa Clara County in California. We are so pleased to have Jackie speak with us today.
Thanks, Brenda, for that very kind introduction.
Great. Jackie, before you get started, let me just say a couple of other things. I have a few housekeeping items before I turn it over to you, Jackie. Today's webinar is approved for 1 CFRE credit point for those of you who are seeking certification or recertification. The webinar is being recorded, and we will have a recording available for you after the event, along with the slides. Be on the lookout for an email later today with both of these items, as well as a short survey asking for your feedback. Everyone joining us is in listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. We will have time at the end of our presentation to take questions. If you have a question at any time during the webinar, please type your question. To type a question, simply click on the Q&A icon in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. That will open a window, and there you can type your question. We will answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A at the end. Lastly, we invite you to join us on Twitter throughout the webinar using the hashtag NPOStrength. We will be live tweeting and invite you to join the conversation there as well. With that, Jackie, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brenda, and thank you to the Alford Group for the kind invitation and for hosting this entire webinar series. I am speaking on behalf of Catholic Charities, but also representing a women's philanthropy group that I helped to found and has been a key partner with me in a lot of my work doing research on new trends in diversity and multicultural philanthropy, the Pan-African Women's Philanthropy Network. A lot of the data I will be citing is coming from a commissioned research report that I did for the Global Fund for Women called Giving 3.0, the American Global Giving Study. Next slide. It has been established for about the past almost 30 years that all people give. Almost every market and social scientific research study has indicated that every demographic on the entire planet and throughout the U.S. gives in some shape, form, or fashion. Despite the fact, next slide, that all people give and that there are philanthropy markets across different ethnic, gender, and racial demographics, there is still a severe underrepresentation of just focusing on people of color in the U.S. nonprofit sector. Although there has been some progress over the past 20 to 30 years in that regard, next slide, donor diversity, according to a recent report by Blackbaud, has been virtually unchanged over the past 30 years. Next slide. In fact, when you look at the high levels of giving from people of color today, it would seem that donor diversity is indeed the last frontier of American philanthropy. We're living through this period, next slide, where there are many, many diverse forms of giving. In fact, a recent study by the Urban Institute suggested that there are now 25 distinct forms of giving, especially when we include various new online giving tools. So we have to move beyond even diversity as a topic in our discussion of contemporary philanthropy and look at multicultural philanthropy. What are the basic principles that cut across all of the different ways that people can give so that we can define the new, which are sometimes old, market segments for giving and tap the new forms of wealth that are emerging to support social impact throughout our community. Next slide. In my research and with my various research partners, we've identified some core approaches to giving, which I call the multicultural wheel of giving. If you look at philanthropy, personal, institutional philanthropy, personal giving, and various hybrid forms, which we organize under the rubric of social enterprise in all countries and all demographics. There is hyper extended family giving. In the context of Africa, for example, there can be extended families that are the sizes of some American small towns or even larger. These are individuals who may not have ever met each other and may, in our cultural context, be effectively strangers, but they are connected by a broadly common lineage. That is a significant form of giving. And in fact, African immigrants in the U.S. have made remittances on average of about $11 billion a year to their hyper-extended families and their communities, and about 20 to 30% of that giving is used to construct hospitals and schools and fund their operations. So that is a component of international giving that is hidden in plain view and is very common among immigrants in the U.S. and other countries of various backgrounds. I'm just going to go over a couple of these forms. There's also a significant amount of giving through what we call giving circles today, but many of these are ancient social structures for giving that can be used to support both community projects and entrepreneurial projects. And many immigrants bring their ancient giving circles to the U.S. and become a part of the giving circle movement. Of course, there is giving through religious institutions and multiple hybrid forms of social finance that mix and match donations of cash, gifts in kind, as well as impact investing. There, of course, there are a variety of forms of digital giving. And so anyone who wants to tap into these new markets for giving should learn about the various forms of giving and how they are being adapted and morphing across various ethnic and other community demographics. Next slide. So there are pockets of wealth in communities that are typically depicted as low income. I think several high-profile nonprofit projects, such as the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which brought a national spotlight to people like Robert Smith, the engineer who is a major donor to his alma mater, Cornell University, but is African American as well, and gives to a variety of culturally specific projects as well. But if you combine, look at the Latino or Hispanic and African American community alone, according to the census in 2011, 7 million of those individuals had a net worth of more than $500,000 at least. In fact, it's Asian Americans in the U.S. who have the highest median income, and it's Nigerian Americans who are the most educated of any American ethnic group. So it is certainly in the best interest of any nonprofit interested in tapping new resources to look at the pockets of concentrated wealth in these communities where they live, and to recognize that sometimes the common or stereotypical depiction of these communities do not represent the true demographics of wealth and philanthropic opportunity for our social project. Next slide. In fact, philanthropy is such a growth industry. If you add up all of these different forms of giving across multiple ethnic groups, there is about a $160 billion giving economy in the U.S. alone. And that includes both these remittances that go to hyper-extended families and are also devoted to what we would call nonprofit projects in communities across the world. Next slide. One of the key barriers to tapping these hidden in plain view sources of wealth and philanthropy is that there is still a large degree of implicit bias and a related lack of institutional diversity that impedes donor diversity. And I want to say this can happen to or with anyone. I happen to be of African American background, but some of the training that I've had working in across various communities does not necessarily translate to the African immigrant community. And so this process of learning about the different forms of giving and how those forms of giving are being proactively and rapidly changed across different communities is a lifelong learning process. What is most important is to be open to new ways of understanding philanthropy, understand how our implicit biases blind us to new philanthropic opportunities, blind all of us, and then deepen our study and understanding of the different forms of giving. Some of these implicit biases are, for example, people of color don't give, so why should we ask? Or people of color only give in small amounts because they're all poor. Or people of color only give to their own organizations or only to religious organizations, or we don't have much diversity in our organization, so why bother asking diverse donors to support us in the first place? And then a really common one that is just too much trouble to develop the networks and relationships in new markets that would be required to tap their philanthropy. Next slide. So we all, I think, need to think about, based on the organizations we're working in, regardless of the organization's background or history or track record, is number one, how can we make the case? What are some of the strategies for making donor diversity real in our organizations? And first, there's a morality argument that our sector is a pillar of our democracy. And in fact, we need to create an opportunity for everyone to fully participate in civic life, and that includes giving. Secondly, diversity today, just because of changing demographics, as we all hear, is an economic necessity. Certainly, the corporate sector understands that and is far more advanced than the nonprofit and the philanthropic sector with multicultural marketing and sales. People of color in some communities, like where I live in California, and some cities, or actually in the state, are the majority. And so that is the direction of the market for all of us, regardless of our background. So whether I'm using examples of people of color, but of course, diversity includes gender orientation, religion, national origin. So just because of the fact that we have a global economy, there is some permutation or combination of that diversity wherever we live. And so to be an effective fundraiser today, one needs to know how to practice across different cultural and other demographics. Sustainability, especially given the trends for new wealth development, will require proficiency in accessing donor diversity. And furthermore, and this is a key lesson through my career, is that being exposed and immersed in diversity fosters innovation that can make all of our organizations stronger and have more social impact. Next slide. Second strategy in terms of making it real is, I think, and I have done these for some organizations, is kind of a diversity, equity, and inclusion assessment or audit that also looks at whether and how one can deepen authenticity and legitimacy and diversity so that our organizations can better access new forms of giving, where communities often expect to see themselves reflected in the staff or the board or various volunteer committees. And I often use the example of asking people to try to imagine a women's college trying to raise money for women, but not having any women on its board or staff. That would raise a question about legitimacy and commitment to mission. I think that devising very concrete, practical DEI, that is diversity, equity, and inclusion plans with qualitative and quantitative metrics is really important, or often the commitment to donor diversity remains rhetorical and does not translate into actual diversification of the donor base. Next slide. A couple of other principles and key strategies is recognizing that there's always diversity within diversity. We often use the general ethnic label, for example, of African American or Asian American or women or what have you. But within each of those categories is a broad range of diversity. And at some point, we're talking about, to a large extent, understanding from the inside out the core motivation of the donor, their background, their interests, and walking the path with them to make those social interests realized. And so avoidance of recognizing that there are market segments, perhaps based on gender and ethnicity, but moving beyond them to a more multicultural perspective, recognizing that there's no such thing as the typical African American or typical Asian American. Within the African American community, for example, there are people whose parents have recently or themselves migrated from African, Caribbean, Latin American, European countries. So there's a range of subcultural diversity behind each of those labels. Cross-cutting the ethnic, genders, and other forms and sexual orientation and other forms of diversity is a generational diversity. In each of the groups I've worked with and studied with over the years, there is a broad range of difference, for example, which I'm sure you've all been exposed to, between the giving of individuals who are 50 years old and above and those who are younger. And then there are even smaller market segments and distinctive patterns of giving as you look more closely at different generational patterns. Especially today in a global economy, there is a fluidity of place and identity. People are born in one place and migrate to another country, or in the U.S. to another city for economic opportunity. There's great exposure to different cultural identities. And so people are deliberately mixing and matching and creating a brand and identity, especially with the advent of social media. That also has to be taken into account. The self-identity of an individual living in the global economy may draw from multiple cultures, some of which they've never even visited. So place and identity can no longer be assumed to be associated with the place one was born or the place one is living. There is community-specific and public giving. For example, people of color donors give not only to causes that address the issues in their specific community, they also give to authentic public institutions that are serving the general population. So there is an opportunity to access diversity, whether your organization has a general public mission or a culturally specific or community-based mission. The key is to represent the community that you are serving or the public you are serving in every aspect of your organization and work. In many communities, I'll use, for example, the African American and Latino community, giving is an identity in itself and is often considered, even across the diversity within those communities, as a core defining aspect of being African American or being Latino or Hispanic. And so giving takes on a greater importance in terms of how it represents is seen to represent an individual's connection to an original homeland or an authentic ethnic identity. Next slide, please. So I think there, if I had to boil it all down, there are about 6 key principles for fostering donor diversity, attracting diverse donors of various backgrounds. One is flexibility. We talked about taking the cultural blinders off and understanding the various forms, I will call it traditional as well as multicultural forms that giving can take. And so being really open-minded and flexible in one how even defines philanthropy is critical as a first step in being open to these new markets and their diversity. I talked about having organizational diversity and authenticity at every level of the organization. One strategy that is sometimes used when an organization gets serious about its diversification strategy is kind of skipping over taking the time to develop authentic relationships with the new donor. And sometimes that can backfire where the new donor feels, well, you may not have good representation of my community in your organization or really even serves my organization, but you discovered I'm the multimillionaire living next door and suddenly you know my name. Just like we would with any new donor, taking the time to do relationship-based cultivation is a really critical, universal first step in accessing new donors, regardless of their diversity profile and background. I mentioned really, I think this needs to be a part of every contemporary fundraiser's toolkit, is understanding what their cultural definition of philanthropy is, and then becoming at least proficient in the different forms of giving that I overviewed at the beginning of this presentation, as represented across different cultures, ethnicity, genders, religion, and social orientation. There's a lot of diversity in the world. It doesn't require going to get a PhD from Indiana University in diversity, but it does mean reading the literature that is available, just like we would read literature on new fundraising techniques or new wealth demographics, so that we at least know what we don't know when we encounter a new situation, and avoid the trap of trying to force the very rich, diverse forms of giving into approaches that are convenient and already known by us. That inhibits the full inclusion of the community, and it also limits your clients' and organizations' access to new forms of wealth. Also, becoming proficient, or at least hiring someone who's proficient in multicultural marketing is truly critical, and understanding that we have to move beyond cultivation to continuous engagement, and that just as is true for the general population, continuous engagement is absolutely critical to retaining, sustaining, and growing donors of all backgrounds. Next slide, please. So those are the end of my remarks on sort of the basics of what I very deliberately call multicultural philanthropy. We all have the opportunity to move beyond or augment and enrich traditional approaches to be more receptive to the diverse forms of giving and wealth patterns that are emerging in philanthropy across the world, not just to raise more money for our organizations and our donors, but to strengthen the communities we work for and democracy itself. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Jackie, thank you so much for your sharing your research and your perspective with us relative to how we approach raising dollars from philanthropists across the spectrum. I do have a couple of questions that I'd like to start with, Jackie. And you talked about moving from cultivation to continuous engagement. It's interesting to me as a professional who has been involved in raising money for major institutions, and now the work that I do with our clients across the country, the challenge that I often hear cited relative to engaging. I oftentimes hear, well, we just don't know, how to find these donors who really care about our organization. Or what I tend to see is people going to the same handful of diverse philanthropists over and over again, where those individuals eventually get burned out and find that they can't answer their phones or emails any longer because everyone is just really kind of bombarding a handful of folks with requests. What insights can you share relative to this question of how do we find them, and then once we find them, what do we do with them? That's typically kind of the sequence of questions that I have, that I often hear our clients cite relative to their challenges.
Right, and I hear that a lot too. And so to some extent, we have a toolkit and some of the principles that we use in working with all donors, like the importance of engagement, and cultivation. They also apply to diverse donors, but I think sometimes we're looking for some sort of alternative magical approach.
Yeah.
That sometimes just doesn't exist. I mean, it's just, to break it down, it's not rocket science. We got to do the work of developing relationships with people. And the whole notion that you can hang up a shingle and say, well, we're interested in diversity now, so where are the diverse people? That's not how you develop a relationship with any new market. And so I would say the initial work of ensuring that your organization, and it's not political correctness, if you want to access the money of new market segments, you have to have those market segments as partners in your organization, because they bring networks. They first bring a degree of authenticity, and then if you're hiring the right people, you have the right people on your board who are connected and credible in those new markets, whether those new markets are, let's say, in Silicon Valley, the Holy Grail, that maybe across the field is accessing the millennial tech billionaire, right? Well, you have to have those millennial tech billionaires somewhere represented in your organization and network, so that you can use snowball marketing and networking techniques and access more of them. And so I think sometimes organizations skip the part of building the multicultural infrastructure of their organizations and go for the donor immediately, and they find out their relationships don't last really long, even if they're able to develop a few, or they keep going back to the same individuals. So in any fundraising effort, one has to develop a pipeline. And so the continuous networking, marketing, I would say in this case too, really understanding how philanthropy is done in those communities, so you can identify the right social structures. So is it key in a particular community? There was, for example, in Minnesota, there was a large Tibetan refugee community, and if you didn't have a connection with the temple, it was really difficult to be considered a credible fundraiser. So understanding the social structure of those communities and how they do giving, walking the talk of diversity within one's organization are critical precursors to developing the credibility and, most practically, the social network that will allow you to keep your diverse pipeline of donors full and to move beyond initial engagement and cultivation to sustain a diverse donor pool.
Thank you, Jackie. Jackie, you talk about this multicultural infrastructure. That's a really interesting concept, because when I hear your response, I hear board, I hear staff, I hear an organization that has heightened its awareness and its mindfulness around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Are those the kind of the key pillars as we kind of think about the framework of the work of engaging with these new markets? Is that there needs to be institutional readiness, that you need to have a board that engages and have representation from the new markets that you're trying to engage. You need to have staff who are equipped and adept at understanding the social structure, i.e., how these new markets prefer to give. I mean, we know how to approach, donors who prefer giving online. We know how to kind of continue to message to them. What are the challenges? Why is it so difficult for organizations to shift in this direction of multicultural infrastructure? Are you seeing an evolution in that area as awareness grows and the need for expanded philanthropy to be in place as key drivers for this? Are you seeing that organizations are just still lagging for one reason or another? What are you seeing relative to organizations leading or lagging relative to these multicultural infrastructure?
All right. Well, I'm trying to keep up because I think you just asked me 10 questions.
I know. Yeah. But what I'm really trying to hone in on is what are the challenges for organizations to create this multicultural infrastructure? Is it a lack of will? Is it a lack of knowledge? What's driving it?
Yeah, well, I can just give you my own thoughts, of course, about it, and I don't know if there's one right answer. So first of all, when I say multicultural infrastructure, I mean not just having people of color or immigrants or women or LGBTQ people represented in one's organization. I'm talking about a whole range of things, and it also, of course, is having the staff represent the community, the board, vendors, volunteers, every aspect of the structure. But I also think it's more than knowing, for example, how African Americans give or how Latinos give. It's for every person in your organization to be able to take their philanthropy toolkit and effectively apply it regardless of the background of the person that they're trying to cultivate. And that's a very different orientation, I think, from how we typically talk about diversity and philanthropy is about making sure we have people of color, et cetera. And I think that's all important. And sometimes people think it's controversial when I say this, but it's not enough. You can have, for example, African American on your board or some African Americans on your staff in a largely African American market that you want to tap. But if those African Americans are not multiculturally proficient, they will not be able to tap, for example, or help you tap the new wealth that's also being brought by Black immigrants from Africa, Latin America, Europe, etc. So really understanding, because culture is less static than it's ever been. It's dynamic. People are deliberately mixing and matching and changing their cultural identities through either migration, international travel, consuming global news, that we really need to learn how to meet people where they are, and that a certain physical package does not necessarily denote the multicultural background or identity of a prospective donor. So I'll use myself as an example. I am African American, but I've lived in many different parts of the world and have kind of consolidated some components of those cultural experiences in Asia, in Europe, and different parts of the US and Latin America. And so I have a different orientation to my giving from what I've learned from all of those places and the experiences that I've had. I have a disciplinary background. I have a set of alma maters. And so that it would be difficult to cultivate me as a donor and to not know all of that other background about me. It's not only that my family grew up in the Jim Crow South and migrated to Philadelphia. There are these other exposures that make up my identity. And so we have to become much more proficient in understanding the parameters of diversity that could exist in one community and in one person. We also, I think, have to have deliberate plans and metrics to promote not just diversity in our organization, but also equity and inclusion, so that you can keep your diverse personnel and volunteers, board members, and donors, and continue to expand them from that basis. I think that moving from the way things have always been done in a particular organization, especially if it allows one to meet the target each year, is very difficult for fundraisers because there's just so much pressure. That's one of the reasons fundraisers have the highest level of turnover in a nonprofit sector. You meet your target one year, and then there's just a higher target than that. And sometimes it is just easier because most managing change in a rapidly changing environment is difficult for most people. So we rely on what has worked before. And I think that has slowed down the innovation and success around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues in our field to its own detriment, because we still have not become the change we want to see, and that limits our ability to attract new constituents and new donors.
Wow. Thank you, Jackie. And that's the point that I wanted you to pinpoint, is the fact that, just by placing a person of color or a woman or any other demographic profile on your board, that's not enough to just have someone and say, okay, now lead us to the money, because all the people who look like you. And I appreciate you pinpointing that and highlighting that it takes more, and it really takes understanding the individual whom you are approaching, similar to the work that development professionals put into pursuing, any, donor in the marketplace. Jackie, we have a question from one of our attendees around their associate board, that the board has grown quickly, yet it is not racially diverse. And the question is, what resources or guidance can you give this person relative to how to increase their success in diversifying their associates board? And I would imagine, like most of our clients who have associate boards, they're most likely looking at, there's generational consideration. Most of these boards are comprised of millennials and Generation Xers, and would be interested in any perspective that you may have on what's motivating, let's say, the younger generation of folks in these new markets, in terms of getting them engaged in organizations when they're at that level of formulating connections to organizations. Do you have any insights on how engagement might be different for some of the newer members of the new markets that we're currently approaching?
Okay, and so, and I'll think specifically about associate boards or affiliate boards. Mm-hmm. So, again, I think it's really important to understand diversity within diversity. You started out your question with talking about how to diversify this associate board ratio. Right. So recognizing that there's generational diversity, there's wealth diversity, there's gender and then sexual orientation diversity, and depending upon the demographics of that particular community and the work that it is doing, I think taking some time to understand the demographic profile and identifying the specific sort of like the civic infrastructure. Where do people get together to discuss social issues? What are those? I mean the actual places, but I mean the actual structures too. Is it sororities? Is it fraternities? For millennials, is it mostly on online groups or these kind of pop-up social gatherings? And so I think that kind of analysis to understand the structures and processes of social and community change discussions is really a first step. And asking the question, what are the authentic, credible organizations and leaders that exist in those communities? And then I think trying to ally yourself with them. So if we have any foundation leaders on the phone or corporations on the phone, Corporations are really good at this in particular. They will underwrite events at those organizations. They will try to get on the planning committees for those organizations. They will provide some kind of seed grant or support, so they are seen as a legitimate partner in the community, as opposed to an organization that is seeking donations, but not authentically interested in the challenges that those communities are facing. And so I think that identifying what you can share as an organization, some organizations have had great impact by doing donor training for new philanthropists among millennial groups, really listening to them and getting their feedback about how your work can be done is critical. I think millennials in particular are not as necessarily interested in more traditional forms of giving, but interested in leaving their own mark and looking at the relationship as more of an exchange of new ideas to promote greater effectiveness, as opposed to taking the stance that sometimes happens that organizations sometimes expect the new donor to give in the way that is convenient for them, but really being willing to modify how one does things to be fully inclusive and open to the new ideas that new money brings with it.
Thank you, Jackie. You know, we are at the almost at the end of our time, and Jackie, I just wanted to thank you for spending some time with us, really discussing this really important topic. The Alford Group felt that it was important to bring and include this as one of our webinar series topics because we see the challenges across the sector relative to engagement of the new markets that are in place. And they're not new markets. We need to figure out
exactly.
They've been here all the time, but organizations are now just really trying to understand how to effectively engage with these markets in a way that is truly authentic and brings value and honors the way that these markets are structured and the way that these markets want to engage in the philanthropic endeavor. So do you have any last words you'd like to share with us before we do our wrap up for the day?
Except that engaging the entire community in giving is more critical and important than ever, given the re-emergence of old conflicts and divisions in our country and across the world. That giving has a way of creating relationships that cut across diversity and build community and mutual understanding. And that is a challenge and an opportunity of every contemporary fundraiser who is right at the cross section of this turning point in our community, where we really need to build relationships across diverse points of view for the sake of building community and our country and democracy. So thanks for engaging me in the conversation, and I look forward to continuing it.
Thank you, Jack. And I also like to thank all of our attendees this afternoon. As a fundraiser, I believe that we are on the front line of advancing this issue on behalf of the organizations that we serve. Fundraisers are key relationship builders. We bring new donors, new people, new relationships, new ideas into our organization. So I want to applaud the development folks on the phone, as well as the volunteers and the executive directors for all of your work and your willingness to be a part of this dialogue this afternoon. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the second webinar in our guest speaker webinar series. You can see the upcoming topics and presenters for the next two webinars. All of this information and how to register is on our website at alford.com. Please keep an eye out for an email later today with the recording of today's presentation, the full slide deck, and a very short survey to tell us how we did. Again, thank you for joining us. This concludes today's webinar. We will now disconnect.